I get really, 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 really frustrated by the whole transgender issue. Um, I think there are just an enormous number of different and competing things going on with it. I think there is bad faith on all across the spectrum to one extent or another. I'm not saying I'm the only one who's operating in good faith on this. There are lots of people operating in good faith. I'm talking about at the level of like activists and that kind of stuff, um, and the media. I think there's just both right and left wing media. I just think there's a lot of deliberate fomenting of anger and paranoia. You'll find these pieces every now and then, particularly after that transgender shooting, where all of a sudden they made transgender people the victims and refused to release the shooter's manifesto, which the manifesto would have been released if it was, a white supremacist or an anti-Semite. They turned it into a thing where it was like the real lesson of this transgender person going into a bank and shooting up the place or mall. The real lesson is that transgender people are in danger, and it's never been more dangerous time to be transgender. And you hear that phrase every now and then, or versions of it. And this is just like one of the examples of what I'm getting at is like, actually, this is the greatest time in all of human history, at least all of American history, to be transgender. And it's more celebrated, it's more accepted, it's more corporatized, it's more than any time in history. I mean, people have been dressing up in drag and all that kind of stuff, and not just like drag queens. I mean, go watch Milton Berle or old Bugs Bunny cartoons, Flip Wilson. I mean, this has been a shtick for a very long time. Now, I understand for the people with gender dysphoria, it's not shtick, it's something else. But my point is like, for people with gender dysphoria, this is the greatest time to be alive in American history. And I would argue that's one of the reasons why we have so much gender dysphoria these days, is in part because it is culturally subsidized. It's simultaneously celebrated, but also seen as transgressive. And in American culture, that's a recipe for getting more of it. When you tell people that it's rebellious, but also that you're awesome for being rebellious, you get a lot more of it. And it's one of the inherent flaws in our culture. There's a deep and rich history of it. Shock the bourgeoisie goes back a long, long way. In my own sort of personal convictions in my personal life is to just treat people with dignity and respect. People know, I've talked about this a million times, I'm a big fan of Deirdre McCloskey. I've done events with her more than once. She was born Donald McCloskey. And I just have nothing but, respect for her. And I would always treat her with respect in person and all that kind of stuff. But, there is this bullying involved in this whole thing that I do not respond well to. Particularly because it has such a political valence to it. There's this great passage in Politics in the English Language. Actually, hold on, I will call it up. Okay, this is, many paragraphs in. Orwell says, in our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Things like the continuance of British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan, can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face and which do not square with the professed aims of political parties. Thus, political language has to consist largely of euphemism, question begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gun, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial, or shot in the back of the neck, or sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. Consider, for instance, some comfortable English professor defending Russian totalitarianism. He cannot say outright, I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so. Probably, therefore, he will say something like this, and this is Orwell imagining what someone would say about this practice. While freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods, and that the rigors which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement. And then Orwell continues, this inflated style is itself a kind of euphemism. A mass of Latin words falls upon the facts like soft snow, blurring the outlines and covering up all the details. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish spurting out ink. In our age, there is no such thing as, quote, keeping out of politics, unquote. All issues are political issues, and politics itself a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. When the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer. I should expect to find, this is a guess, which I have not sufficient knowledge to verify, that the German, Russian, and Italian languages have all deteriorated in the last 10 or 15 years as a result of dictatorship. But if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should and do know better. The debased language that I have been discussing is in some ways very convenient. And then he goes on and on and on. I mean, it's one of the greatest essays in the English language. And I tried, in a way, to make Tyranny of Cliches, my underrated second book, an homage to the spirit of that essay. And again, failed in all sorts of ways. USA Today had a story about women, which is the relevant part of the population. Not all women, but it's the relevant part of the population that can bear children. And that is a medical fact, right? I understand that as a matter of cultural construct and whatever, there are people who were born biological males that we're supposed to call women. I get it. I think it's a more complicated thing than a lot of people want to simplify it. But at the end of the day, I am sort of on just the side of clarity of language and truth. And so anyway, you heard that Al Pacino, which I think is kind of gross, even though I'm very pro baby, Al Pacino at age 83 is having a kid. There's just something unseemly about actuarially having a very low probability of being able to see your kid turn 5. That bothers me. But I'm not second guessing the woman who had the baby. I don't know any of the facts about it. It just really old dudes having relations with much younger women. There's just something about it. Creeps me out. Anyway, USA Today had this tweet about this article that they published. And I'll read it. This is me reading it verbatim. Al Pacino's news exposes a frustrating truth. Those who want to bear children face a biological clock, while their partners can wait decades longer. Now, if you just had that on a chalkboard and you had no knowledge about politics or stuff, you'd think that was a crazy sentence. Or if you were someone from Mars, you would think that literally it's the wanting to bear children that creates a biological clock, right? Those who want to bear children face a biological clock. while their partners can wait decades longer. It's as if you don't want to bear the child, you can wait decades because there's no biological clock. But if you want to bear the child, that ex nihilo creates a biological clock, right? And really what we're trying to avoid here is that women have shorter biological clocks than men do in terms of being able to, that's, sperm, viability lasts a lot longer than egg viability does. This is just a fact. It's a painful fact for a lot of people. There are ways to deal with it that are of, varying degrees of efficacy and all that. The need to talk around these basic facts, I find offensive. It just bothers me. And I don't think it's like, look, there are social untruths, right? There are, I don't mean like in a platonic way or in a Sorelian way about the vital lie, right? The noble lie stuff. I just mean like society works on certain fictions that we all agree is a matter of manners not to get too deep into. And I get that. I just don't think that this is one of them. And I think there's just something profoundly bullying and sort of mildly culturally totalitarian about saying that everybody has to conform to this construction. It's like when DeSantis corrected some reporter about gender affirming care. Gender affirming care really is a very, going back to the passage I read you, a very Orwellian construction, right? I mean, Orwell would say they call it gender affirming care, but what they really mean is cutting off genitalia of children, or at least teens, right? And that should make people feel uncomfortable. I'm not saying it's always wrong. There's all sorts of, we can get all, I don't want to get into all the deep weeds about the caveats and the counter examples and exceptions to the rule and intersex this and all the rest, right? I mean, there are things going on. Rich Lowry had this column, he made this point the other week about how, sorry, my lethological is kicking in. The crazy attractive actress who was in the first Transformers movie. Gosh, I can't remember her name. Don't email it to me. I'll remember 10 seconds after I hit I stop recording. But anyway, super hot, and she has body dysphoria. And nobody says to her, oh, so therefore you should, we should also just conform to your view that you're fat when you're not, or that you're ugly when you're not, right? And I understand it's not a perfect analogy, because there's all sorts of others. That's the sort of transgressive thing, the rebellious thing, the celebratory thing, that feeds into this, and I'm sure a dozen other psychological factors that causes men to say that they're biological men to say they're women, or biological women to say they're men, and if this was something that only happened to people above the age of 21, I'd have a sort of a different attitude about it. It's one of the reasons I haven't cared much about it over the years, is because most of the transgender stuff of the sort that we're talking about is, the cases you'd hear about were of, like older dudes who, decided fairly late in life that they wanted to sort of switch teams, as it were. But when this starts playing into kids, I just think it's something that you have to take more seriously and not cloud it up with all of this euphemism. And, and it's interesting to me is that, speaking broadly with lots of exceptions, right? This is a generalization, but as a generalization for the last 100 years, progressives or the left, cultural, liberal elites, urban elites, whatever labels you want to use, have generally been inclined towards arguments to say, let's look to what Europe is doing. Let's follow Europe's lead. Let's be more like Europe. Well, most of Europe profoundly disagree. And when I say most of Europe, I mean like the medical experts and the medical establishments including in places like Sweden, they disagree with the whole gender affirming care thing for minors. Go check out the Economist story on this. And that should at least cause you not to say that people who have qualms about some of this stuff are bigots, right? I got no problem, none, being told I'm wrong. And if you want to provide the argument for why I'm wrong, that's even better. That's great, you know. And I'm going to concede in advance because I can smell it coming in the comments already. Some of my complaints don't apply in all instances, and there's some places where gender reassignment makes total sense, and I agree with that, and that's fine. But we're talking about a level of generalization. There are going to be exceptions to the rule, and that's fine, and I concede it. But don't give me the one counterexample and then say this proves that all of the other examples are justified as well. Anyway, what I'm just getting at is that there is this, like, it is a sign of lack of confidence in the actual merits of your position if you shroud everything in euphemism, right? I mean, this is my problem going back to George Lakoff's stuff about linguistics, right? Where he became this guru of the Democratic Party for a while, arguing that, we should stop calling them trial lawyers and call them community protection attorneys. And we should stop calling taxes and call them membership fees. And I find that generally this obsession with words, I've talked about this before, this idea that words are magic steers everybody ultimately on the left and the right into bad places. Yeah, words matter. Words are my living. I'm a big believer in labels. I think labels matter because that's how we communicate ideas. But you can put too much emphasis in the power of words and labels when you start talking about them as if they have, alchemical, is that a word? Alchemy-like powers where they can transmogrify reality and bend it towards your worldview, right? When it becomes a tool of solipsism and myopia, to say that, that when you start arguing about the words as if the words are things, how can you be against gender affirming care? I mean, if you just change it to how can you be against removing the penis of a 12-year-old boy? I mean, like, it might still be an argument about that kind of thing to do that, but every normal person can at least intuitively understand why you might have a problem with it. That's why, DeSantis made that line about how, look, it's not gender affirming care, it's mutilation. Now, it may not be mutilation in all cases, but my point is like, and mutilation may be a loaded word in some cases. I'm open to all of that. I'm really trying hard to be open-minded about all of this stuff. But just the idea that somehow we have to get rid of words like mother, that we have to treat, like that womanhood, that biological motherhood, all of these things. And biological motherhood is not the only form of motherhood, motherhood and all that kind of stuff. I've talked about that a bunch. I did a solo podcast about a month ago about how much I hated Margie Taylor Greene's thing about how if you're not a biological mother, you're not a real mother, which is just such a grotesque thing for pro-life or nominally pro-life people to say, given that, one of the keys to reducing abortion is to encourage adoption. And adoptive mothers are mothers. Anyway, I'm trying to be open-minded about it, but there's just so much emphasis on if we can just play with the words, everything else will fall into place. If we can win the argument about the labels, reality will flow. And I find it particularly vexatious sometimes on the right, how Foucaultian, so many people on the right have gotten about, this is one of my problems with DeSantis is this obsession with narratives. We just change the narratives and we don't like the media's narratives. We have to create our own narratives. It was like, what creates new narratives? New facts, right? Change the facts on the ground and the narratives will follow.